Welcome to the show that explores the methods and strategies on rocking the financial side of your music business. With over 40 years combined experience, here are your hosts, Chris Webb and Dave Tamkin.
Welcome to Musicians Tip Jar, where we talk about musicians and money. I'm Chris Webb, joined by my co-host Dave Tamkin, who recently went through a breakup with his sound engineer because they had too much treble. Welcome to the show, Dave.
I'm definitely rubbing off on you.
I mean, eventually they're going to run out of these.
No, you think that, but there's a plethora of dad jokes for us both to share.
Musician dad jokes. Yeah. Specific niche right there, you know? Today we welcome multi-platinum producer Vince Dipasquale. We go on a journey from his early struggles to the driver's seat of being an in-demand producer and remixer. His story is filled with celebrities in all kinds of genres. It's pretty amazing. Today's quote comes from Vince himself. He said, "It's not the one who thinks they're great that's getting the opportunities. It's the one that does the job, does it good, and doesn't have a bad attitude."
Today's nonprofit is girlsmakebeats.org. They are on a mission to close the gender gap in music education and technology. They are here to change the image of what music producers, DJs, and audio engineers look like. Their programs have served over 900 girls across the country and around the world since 2012. 3/4 of the girls they serve come from historically underrepresented groups, including Black, Latino, and low-income households. Learn more at girlsmakebeats.org. Find this information useful, please rate and subscribe to the podcast, and also slam that like button if you're on YouTube so we can help keep you up on the finance side of your music business.
Vince Dipasquale is an artist whose talent and dedication have propelled him to multi-platinum success. He is a renowned music producer, remixer, and educator with over 2 decades in the music industry. He's worked alongside some of the biggest names in music, including Madonna, Justin Timberlake, Mariah Carey, Timbaland, Nelly Furtado, and Missy Elliott. His remix of Madonna's hit 4 Minutes not only soared to number 1 in the Billboard Dance Club charts, but it also achieved double platinum certification. Beyond his impressive career as a producer, Vince is passionate about empowering the next generation of music makers. He co-founded FaderPro, an innovative education platform offering aspiring producers unprecedented access to industry-leading artists and their creative processes. Today, Vince is here to share his wealth of knowledge, creativity, and entrepreneurial wisdom, helping us all better navigate our journeys in this business. Let's find out how he has achieved so much. Let's go.
Today we have Vince Dipasquale. He cooks up pizzas on his grill on Father's Day. True. We just listed a whole bunch of stuff that you haven't heard that just makes you sound very cool and just about your awesome career. So without you even knowing what we said, just, congratulations on a successful career.
Thank you.
Half of it we made up, and then the other stuff.
Yeah, you met the Pope? That's amazing.
Yeah. I'd like to start with your early beginnings. Let's begin with your earliest memory of falling in love with music and what inspired you to pursue this career.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I'm glad you started at the very beginning. Obviously, different answers as to where I got to each path, but the long story is short as I guess needs to be. Is I grew up in a very musical family. My grandfather was a jazz sax player from like the big band era, and grew up listening to him play sax. And my father, huge rock and roll fan, Beatles, the whole British Invasion, rock and roll, and so I grew up with him having a deep love of music and even recorded music. He had a quadraphonic system that I only mention because, number one, they no longer exist, and number two, he was an audiophile, and so my mom was a night teacher, and his way of babysitting us was to throw records on the quadraphonic system and run my sister and I ragged from dancing until we passed out. That was his his babysitting technique. But so that did two things. That put us to sleep easily, and I subconsciously and in real time kind of got this amazing education of recorded music, and he played guitar in high school himself and was in a few little bands and things like that. So I got into instruments pretty early too, first with piano and played piano, but suffered through it because I don't learn classically and I was taught classically. So you can imagine the friction there. And so, but I had a really good ear. And so I would do all these classical piano lessons and kind of suffer through them, but then go just noodle and have fun. And especially with guitar, I took up guitar around the age of 9. And same thing, had kind of classical lessons and would suffer through those. But then on my own would just learn to play with my favorite records. And so developed my ear just by jamming along. It was about in high school then at that point, I had stopped taking all lessons because school was never really my thing, which is funny because now I'm an educator. We'll get to that later. I got in high school, jammed a little bit with some people, but never did the band thing. I didn't have any practice discipline. My brain wasn't wired that way at that time. So I would just jam to my favorite records and, knew enough chords. If I had to pick up a guitar at a party, I could, but didn't really love to do that.
Everyone loves that guy who picks up a guitar at a party.
And plays one song and is like, all right, I'm done. No, keep going. Nah.
First chorus of Wonderwall.
Yeah. So my high school had a radio program and my dad knew this guy who owned a music store. And so I began renting recording equipment and got really into by myself in my parents' basement learning to record. And it wasn't, telling a story now, it wasn't like, ooh, I'm going to go record. It was just another way to dabble with music and audio. And at that time, MIDI was kind of in its infancy, in the early 90s. I've dated myself just then. So was kind of fiddling with MIDI and programming the drum machines of the day and recording on my 4-track, which I still actually have sitting right over there, the original one. I still run stuff through it. We can maybe talk about that later if it's pertinent. And so got into the technical side. And so in college, I actually got a business degree. I was never, like I said, in the kind of performing music arena. So just by default and by the urging of my mother, got a business degree, which was really good advice for later in life. And so during college, I would be doing all the business stuff in school, but then was like on the radio. I had a radio show in college and had my 4-track tape machine and would record anyone that would let me record them. And I also recorded a ton of live concerts. I had a phase as a Deadhead where I traveled and toured and recorded the Grateful Dead with a pretty cool little setup on DAT tape. So I was just kind of, by that point in college, had become a real true kind of audio nerd. And then after college, I did a stint working in Orlando, Florida in the mid 90s. And at that time, electronic music had really, it was kind of like the British version of electronic music in the mid 90s. Some DJs in Orlando brought over these really big DJs that were big in Europe. And this was still, of course, underground here in the United States. And so while I was in Orlando, I got exposed to the electronic music scene.
Is that why you moved there to Orlando?
No, I got a job for Walt Disney World, actually, during college. I worked there for 2 years, partly as a semester of college, kind of a work study thing. And then I just stayed on and kept working there. So I did a gap year before I knew that even was a thing.
What were you doing for them?
I worked at Epcot. It was called the Ambassador Program. And so Epcot has all the countries, and they bring all the employees from those actual countries so you can experience the culture. And so I was an American ambassador, which meant we helped all the foreign employees, navigate life in America. And we were just kind of their friends and helped them. And also we did, customer service things, like we would walk dignitaries around the park and have random jobs in customer service. And so there was an educational component around how the business of Disney was ran. But mainly it was just a college kid working at Disney, cheap labor for them, great experience for me. And it really kind of did change the trajectory of my life, to be perfectly honest, because I grew up in Ohio and that got me out of Ohio. And so that was what took me there.
So this note I have is dressed up as Donald Duck. That's not true.
That's right. That's right.
No, okay.
However,
taking
right,
that out.
I
All right.
was Prince Charming in a parade. That is true, though. One
Oh,
time.
well, you're
Nice.
always so kind. I would say you're doing that all the time, Vince. Well, I didn't mean to cut you off from the DJ stuff, but that is interesting. What brought you down there? And
Yeah.
kept you
So,
there for a while.
you know, at that time, you know, in Europe in the mid 90s, DJs were rock stars. DJs were the new rock stars, and electronic music was played on the radio. This was all, you know, a decade pretty much before that happened in the United States. And so I fell in love with electronic music because these producers were doing everything. They were programming everything, writing everything. It was all in the computers. It was all with computer and audio nerdery, and I just loved it. And I, you know, and I enjoyed the kind of cutting edge sounds that were happening in electronic music. So that was when I really got into electronic music. And so the rest of my way through college, you know, was DJing a lot and starting to learn how to produce electronic music. Kind of started to self-teach myself that. And then after I got a business degree, I went to the School of Audio Engineering, SAE Institute, down in Miami. And I was the first graduating class because we moved. By that point, my now wife and then girlfriend moved down to Miami, and she continued studying. And I had random odd jobs in the audio industry, which I think is pertinent to this conversation because I always was trying to find any way to do anything related to music. And at that point, I worked at record shops. I had a stint constructing, and by constructing, I mean assembling home theater speakers, you know, and doing home theater installations, all while I was DJing and trying to learn music production. So I went to SAE Institute, got an engineering degree, which took about a year and a half. And then out of there was placed with Lauryn Hill for 6 months on one of her recording projects. So that was like my first, like just graduated as an engineer, to go work with Lauryn Hill, which was a mind-blowing experience. She's totally incredible. So I did that for 6 months. And then after that, got hired by the Hit Factory Criteria in Miami recording studio. And this was 2002, and became a staff engineer there. And at the same time, I had these parallel kind of worlds where I was at SAE learning, you know, audio engineering, working with Lauryn Hill, getting at the Hit Factory, but still producing electronic music at home. So I was by that point, you know, making my own music. I had signed a couple record deals with some electronic labels, had my first few releases, then got invited separately. Well, not invited, I should say. A friend of mine from New York City said, "Hey, I got this friend who has a project that he needs mixed, and he just moved to Florida. He knows nobody. Can you meet him and maybe help him mix his project?" And so I said, sure. So, you know, I had a home studio at that point. This is still, you know, early 2000s. So I had a 32 channel Tascam analog board, and fresh out of engineering school, you know, and this was one of my first, you know, besides all the big studio stuff I was doing, you know, as my quote unquote day job, I was at home and met this guy, Albert Cabrera. And he's like, "Hey, I've got this project called Lee Cabrera. We've got this first record. I want to mix it with you. I want to mix it. So can you help me?" So we mixed it on my board, and that song, Lee Cabrera Shake It, was the name of the song, became like a absolute international smash in electronic dance music. And it just, to this day, it's one of those seminal records that I was fortunate enough to touch and engineer. So I engineered all those guys' records. And you know, he didn't pay me for that gig. He bought me Logic Pro, which back then was like version 3. And he's like, it was still when, you know, Logic was pretty expensive. He's like, "Well, I won't pay you for this, but I'll just buy Logic because I did the whole thing in Logic. So you need it anyway." So that introduced me to Logic. And so, so that was great. I now had this kind of engineering kickoff of a career, if you will, from that one project with these guys that now were, you know, very successful, making tons of music.
What was that learning curve like? Because you started out by saying when you were playing classical music, but you didn't learn classically. So you had this different way of absorbing knowledge. So now you're going to become an engineer, or going to school for that, but you're also looking at contracts now for record labels. How are you navigating those fields at that time?
At that time, I just kind of said yes to everything. And, in hindsight, there was part, sheer willpower, a lot of obviously hard work, some naivete obviously mixed into that pot. I just, had, from very early on, and again, in hindsight, looking back, I just had several irons in the fire. And I think, even now, sitting here saying that, I mean, even today, I think for me personally, that has been what has allowed me to do music production and engineering and music creation full time for, over 20 years now. Is I think the, I love this word entrepreneurship, it's entrepreneurship, from a creative mindset. And back then I would have never said these things like, oh, just a lot of irons in the fire and be entrepreneurial. I was doing that without really knowing. I was just kind of saying yes and trying to put myself in places that would maybe give me an opportunity. So just to kind of wrap up the about me story, I guess, so at that time, again, had my home studio, was doing a lot of electronic music and producing it, and was then working at the Hit Factory as a staff engineer there. And, this was, I was an employee as an engineer and, started off as an assistant engineer, which is basically a runner, like go get lunch and sweep up this mess and make the fruit bowl and make the flowers look pretty and all that kind of thing, which was an amazing experience because, in those days, and especially at a studio like that, it was very humbling to come in and, everyone comes in and they're like, yeah, I have an audio engineering degree and here's all the consoles I know how to use and here's all the gear. And they're like, great, go make coffee. It was kind of that kind of.
Do you have to work on your stamina for that at first, where you're like out of breath a lot and you're like, this is too much? And then maybe second week, you're like, no problem, coffee. And like, oh, how did I get it back so fast?
No, it was 9 or 10 months of constant questioning, like, wow, is this the right choice? Honestly, because, the engineers, that there's not many of them. And when you get that job, there's not a high turnover, and so it was just naivete or stubbornness or whatever it is. I just kept going and I did, I did keep my eye on the prize, I guess, for lack of a better word. I knew if I stuck it out that maybe an opportunity would come and then it eventually did.
And what was that opportunity? This is when it gets good, Chris.
This is when it gets good. So by this point, we're now close to a year of making fruit baskets and flowers and coffee and cleaning up messes of very famous people. Then I, at home, by this point, had started my electronic music production had then transferred. I met a person and he and I collaborated. So now I was doing remixes for a lot of major labels, for a lot of, high profile artists doing electronic remixes, which for me was a dream because it married all worlds. It married commercial music. I love commercial music. It married production, the technical, and my early dream of music, which was to create, to write, to record, and all these things. And so I was at home in my studio doing all these remixes and getting to a point where I couldn't do both anymore full time. And, was taking long walks and trying to figure out what the right move is. And so one day I went in to the manager's office and I said, Trevor, I'm done. I can't, I was still a general assistant, so I was still kind of the errand boy. I said, I can't do this anymore, unfortunately. And he looked at me and he's like, are you sure? Because he had a way of kind of wording things that had you questioning something. And at that point, I kind of had this fear wave roll over me. Like I had stuck it out this long, and I said, yeah, I'm sure. And the next day he called me and he's like, do you want to engineer? Which there was a need there for that. It was whatever it is, divine intervention or whatever stars aligning it is. And so I shifted then from kind of being full-time to then being, a staff engineer. And then you're kind of on call all the time.
But what's awesome about that story is the wave of fear that came over you. And even the way you tell the story, I'm thinking you're going to say, and I stuck it out for 3 more months. But no, you followed your gut. You knew what you wanted, not only out of your career, but a life.
Yeah, and at the time, I think, again, my brain now looks back and says, if you have to choose, and back then I didn't. Back then it was like, I'm doing all this work. I want to be a producer and an engineer and a writer and a creator, and that's over here. Yes, I do want to be an engineer, for artists too, but it did win out, honestly. And it worked out because, I got lucky, to be honest with you, because, the next day there was a need and I was the phone call. So from that point on, I was now, engineering there. They would, you're on call as an engineer. So, you get a phone call, you're working with so-and-so today, you're working with so-and-so. That could last a single session, a single day, a week, a month, various projects. And then at home still was doing all the remixing and production, which at that point was starting to branch out into not just electronic music, but singer-songwriters, other bands. And so, I did those kind of parallel worlds for about the next, 8 years.
Wow.
Down in Miami.
One thing that comes up a lot with interviews about how people kind of find success is that it sometimes can be kind of, in hindsight, can be narrowed down to just a couple moments.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like that moment that you decided you instinctively knew that it was time to make a change, and the sweat that came out of you in the moment of making that change and how scary that can be might be one of those moments where it was like, if you hadn't done that the rest of this would never have happened, right? That butterfly effect of it, because you wouldn't have shown him maybe that you were ready to do that next thing, or made yourself realize that you were truly ready for that next thing.
It's true. And, I think, doubt and questioning, and certainly a level of fear in this field, but a lot of times in life, it's part and parcel with these hard decisions. And sometimes the hard decisions are well thought out. Now that I'm older, I have ways of working through these types of decisions. Back then I was young and just was just trying to work as hard as I could. But yeah, I think I innately did know that that's the path that I wanted to go down, and who knows what would have turned out if I never got the phone call. Well, I mean, a lot would have been different, obviously, but yeah, I remember making the decision, which was not easy. And I remember being in the office and hearing, "Are you sure?" with this look like, and my interpretation of that question was, "Are you sure because you're like this close?" And what I was reading into it was like, "Are you sure because if all the fear stuff." And, and I was sure, heart beating, scared as hell, all the things, but for reasons I can now kind of fill in the blank, I just stuck to it,
Yeah.
but it was not easy.
And maybe he needed someone to make those hard decisions, to say you were sure, because next you're moving on to work with people like Madonna, Timbaland, Mariah Carey, and someone who's unsure of what they want out of their future is someone that he doesn't want behind the board for those situations.
And that's a very good point, Dave. And that was that whole year of getting caught. Everybody's heard the runner, like, go make coffee and clean up the, mess, insert creative messes here. You're right. And the proving process then was not about necessarily the engineering chops. What is important is going and learning engineering, going and doing a lot of the things in a creative field is, a lot of people are doing that. That's not the differentiator. What the differentiator is, your personality. And in this case, what's going to happen when a high profile client who's impossible to please is barking at you to do things? How are you going to handle that? And so this whole trial by fire, kind of break you down, build you up thing, Dave, was exactly the point. The point, because during that year, it's wild because sessions would start in the evening and we'd be repainting the walls during the day because someone scuffed it up. I mean, we were just constantly doing stuff. So you paint the wall and it's the wrong color of paint. So you got to do it again. Well, maybe it wasn't the wrong color of paint. Maybe that was partly like, okay, that's not good enough. Like, go do it again. And so the people that are like, having the reaction that you would have when you've done it 2 or 3 times are not the people that maybe they want at that studio. And so, I had an idea of that. To me, there's like this iceberg type thing where there's like, the percentage you see above the water, and then below it is 90% of everything else. That's kind of how I viewed it at the time, even then, and also as a marathon. I viewed it as a marathon and not a sprint. And I did sprint during times of my life, but in this career, but I tried to always look at it as
you
like
were a runner.
But if I did a marathon pace though at the Hit Factory, they would have fired me. The second week, you'd be a sprinter. So
yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So again, that kind of taught me so much. And to back up to Disney, I made all the mistakes as an employee or a young person who thought they were like, something, right? In the jobs I thought I wanted to have at Disney, and I saw my friends in the program getting cooler jobs than me, and I was kind of like, well, why aren't I getting the cool jobs? That was, looking back, my learning process of how not to do it. So fast forward to the Hit Factory. By then I had some wherewithal of like, okay, it's not the one that thinks they're great. It's the one that just does the job, does it good, and like doesn't have a bad attitude.
That's so often the biggest part of being successful is, are you fun to work with? Right? Like, despite all of the other things that are happening around you and the pressures that are probably existing in that situation, are you still fun to work with? One other question I wanted to ask about, as you got started and started finding yourself working with these incredible artists, did you feel like, and as an educator, maybe this would be something that you can add to that, did you feel like you were well prepared for all of the technical end of things that you had to do right out of the gates with these opportunities because of your education that you got from the university? Or did you feel like you had to learn those in the hard knock style?
That's a really good question. It's both. For me, it was both. Back then, to get into a studio like the Hit Factory, they wouldn't look at you, unless you had a degree from Full Sail or SAE. So the piece of paper was necessary, and you can equate that to the business degree too. However, unfortunately, in our world, the piece of paper will get you in the door, but that's when you start learning really whatever the piece of paper says a little about. And so in the case of engineering, we had practice time as a general assistant. Yes, you were doing all the errands and stuff, but you got to, as long as the studio was open, you could go in there and do stuff, and you were encouraged. And so you did know every single thing on the 96 channel SSL, and you knew every, like the back of your hand, and so it was the school of kind of hard knocks of hitting the, the rubber hitting the road. Same thing with the business degree that comes in later, but I'll go ahead and kind of give that away now. It's like in 2004. So now I'm doing all these remixes. I'm working at the Hit Factory, and I worked on Nelly Furtado's Maneater, and it was doing phenomenally well. And I'm working in Logic, and a mentor engineer of mine that I was working with at the Hit Factory, his name is Jimmy Douglas. He knew some people at Apple, and somehow the word got around that, I work in Logic, and I had worked on that song. And so Apple reached out to me and said, did you do any of this stuff in Logic? And I said, yeah, I did. And so at that point, I had also been invited back by SAE to give a lecture to the current class of like audio, aspiring engineers. And I gave a lecture about my story, but also about, music production. And I loved it so much. I had so much fun, and, the feedback was really good, that I started to do more lecturing at SAE, and that got me into education. And then, back to Apple, they invited me, to NAMM one year to give a demonstration on making music in Logic Pro using Nelly Furtado's Maneater. And it was a ton of fun, and kind of got a front row seat with the Apple team and got to know them, and that was an amazing experience. But that's kind of the landing of the airplane of like how I got into education, was through that. Because after all these events that I would do, everyone would come up and say, where can I learn more? Can I come hang out in this? Where do I learn more? And that was the birth of FaderPro, which is the online education company that I founded, teaching music production. So that's kind of the full circle of my story in terms of engineer, and then starting FaderPro and getting into education.
Is processes like privacy?
I just don't think processes
I agree.
sounds right.
I liked it. I was impressed with it. It was nice having Vince. I was fortunate enough to work with him on a project for a Ben Queller song a few years ago, and I wasn't very good at it. And he was very patient and kind with me the entire time. So it was nice to see him again.
And I like the connection that he was previously teaching at the University of Colorado, Denver. It's really cool that we never crossed paths while there, but I'm sure those students got a lot out of him being there when he was there.
So if two musicians teach at a school, but they don't see each other, are they really teaching?
I thought you were going to say, does one actually make a sound?
That's where I was going with it.
We will never know. Because they won't release it anyway. But to talk about his story a little bit, really enjoy interviewing people like Vince, because he comes from this place of this organic desire to be an artist, and so much of how we get to where we end up. And when we start talking about our journey, so many of the things that we've done to get there have been sort of these decisions in the moment. You're not thinking long term when certain opportunities come up. You just know that opportunity feels right, And that was sort of a theme in his story, was making decisions based on how it felt and his instincts, and how he knew that it was instinctively going to be a good choice to say yes to some of these things. And there was a lot of stuff that he had to say no to, but pretty much in those early years, as we'll talk about, it was all saying yes. And that's so common in the stories of people that we interview, that in the early years, it's so critical to just keep saying yes and being that yes person,
Well, he instilled that in himself, even having difficulty learning instruments and in school at the beginning. You think a musician who, is like okay at playing music at first would be like, I'm giving up. And that was more than just one instrument. And he just kept pushing and getting better and followed that dream to be a musician. If it wasn't from an educational standpoint of being taught from a teacher, he was going to do it somehow, learn it by ear.
And it really does seem to be another pattern that we've seen, that the instrument doesn't make the artist, right? I mean, would Jimi Hendrix have still been a great artist without the electric guitar? Yes. He would have expressed it differently, and maybe it would have had to be received differently. It's sort of their communication. It's his language. And sometimes when we're trying to expand our vocabulary, going with this metaphor, we're not as good at learning certain things as others. And that can't be what stops you. If you're an artist inside, you just have to figure out how to let it out. And he really did that. And he's got a common story there where I think a lot of people, especially artists, they tend to struggle in school. They tend to struggle with education. I experienced plenty of that too. And I still wonder if I'm dyslexic. I actually don't know. And I mean, there's signs for sure. But again, it's you use it if you can. You use all of those characteristics in who you are to help you continue pushing forward and being unique and having something to offer, and then also being empathetic to others and understanding that everyone struggles.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean failure. The struggle doesn't mean failure. And I think when you play by feel, it can reveal a better route for you in your future. And it definitely did that for him.
Totally. And you might have said moving to Florida might have been a failure. I'm just kidding. To all of our Florida listeners, I'm just kidding. I just like to give Florida a hard time. But I do like Disney World, so my kids love it. So, I mean, I do think that there's so much about moving to a new place that pushes you to keep focused on why you moved there. It sort of raises your expectations for don't waste this time, because it's a sort of a limited situation.
Yeah, I know that firsthand, for sure.
There you go.
Yeah.
And getting into the electronic music scene, I loved how he said he was one of the first to graduate with that in that program. And I think that he's paved a way in a lot of ways. Like that program has probably only grown.
He mentioned Full Sail. My senior year of high school, Full Sail College was then called Rock and Roll University. And for $99 at Rolling Meadows High School, you could sign up. They would put you on a plane for a day. You'd land in the morning and go to Full Sail University and see everything they had to offer. And then you'd fly back that evening. It was like a field trip for seniors to see if you wanted to do this for future. But at the time, you see Rock and Roll University and you're like, but it's come so far since then. It's way more than just a music university.
Yeah, really has grown. And how great to have found those resources. As he said, a lot of these opportunities without that degree they wouldn't be an option because he couldn't have gotten that first job. Even though he was an errand boy, the job still required having that piece of paper.
Yeah.
Even though, as he said, you really don't learn, you start doing what it is you start learning what it is you thought you were learning in college when you start doing the job, and you only got the job because of that piece of paper of trying to learn what you're supposed to do in college. And that's unique to that aspect of the music industry, I think.
Well, when we also talk about diversifying your income, that's all he did was from selling records in shops to everyday odd jobs that fed his audio obsession, made a point to stay near sound no matter what from any aspect. So it's like, what did he say? Proximity to your passion matters. I thought that was great advice.
The odd jobs thing to me too also stands out because I think we hear this a lot, and I certainly think this is true with myself, that it was those odd jobs that taught me a lot about the character and who I am, and strengths that maybe music doesn't bring out directly by being a musician. When I had a sales job, I learned a lot about the fact that I'm good at sales. And I actually think that's a common thing as artists go, we're good at sales. And I think that's because we understand people. We understand the inner workings of how we feel and think and how that influences our decision making. And for that reason, I think we're good salespeople. But I don't think I would have learned that if I was only doing music. It's those odd jobs, learning how to do things, fix things, learning how to say yes when you have to help someone else, and humbling your ego, perhaps. And all of that builds the character of you, the artist, when you're on stage, and helps you look back and realize it's been a long journey getting to where it is that you wanted to go.
And also how to create demand for your presence, your product, your music. I think that helps out a lot too. If you're trying to sell something, you have to create that demand for your audience.
Yeah, we use sales all the time, for sure, especially as performers. I mean, the fact that he didn't even put Lauryn Hill in his bio.
Yeah.
Man, amazing.
And did you see the parallel with sides too, with Logic Pro?
Totally. And it makes it sound like we're kind of biased here because that's pretty much all we use on campus too. But I truthfully think you need to learn multiple ones. And it's not that hard. Once you've learned one, the others really do feel a lot easier. And that's probably true with languages, too.
Yeah.
Certainly it's true with instruments. Like we said earlier, like when you start to learn one instrument, the other instruments start to become easier. There's a less of a learning curve, right?
Yeah. And with Logic Pro, though, he was also given that as a gift, which he then made that gift work for him. So it wasn't even the monetary thing that he got in return. So it's the value doesn't always come in dollars, comes in tools, knowledge for your future potential. And then because he became a master at that, again, Apple came calling for him, just like Sides.
What about the scary choices? What about looking back, as we talked about on there, I really do think we could all do this. It's actually probably good exercise to try to simplify how you are to where you are right now by like 3 to 4 moments in life, And I know that might feel like oversimplification, but I think sometimes when you allow that vision of that being reality, of how you've just made a couple things that made such huge impacts over the long haul afterwards, I'd like to think that we all could do that, and it's good for us because we see a simplification to our journey. I mean, people do it on their bio all the time, right? I grew up playing music, and then I got to open up for Taylor Swift, and now, I'm releasing an album, and you're like, okay, there's a lot in there, but you just simplified it to like 4 things. And his scary moment of saying yes, or
Saying no.
of quitting, his scary moment of quitting, I think is one of those. I think that's when you just sort of feel that. I have a recognition of one of those moments when we started to do this podcast, when I just felt that urge. There's like an overwhelming urge in me while I was driving my car home from teaching an in-house lesson. And I really don't do those anymore because I don't really have the time in my schedule for them. And at that moment, I was thinking, I'm ready for the next thing. Like, I remember feeling like I'm really ready to move forward to do this next big opportunity. I didn't know what it was, but you and I had been talking, and then I remember just getting home and being like, I know what I need to do. This needs to get pushed forward. And
Yeah.
I think that moment in the car, even though that moment wasn't saying yes or no to anybody, it was just sort of being like, I felt overwhelmingly ready. You know what I mean? And that moment is one of those moments for me because I think everything changed after that.
You've also continued to do that. I mean, month in and month out for now 3 years. So your gut was telling you something. Just like his gut was saying, like, hey, I could only get coffee and paint this wall so many times.
Right. Right. Well, and as you go, your income streams change. And I liked how he explained his revenue streams because he kind of took us through the journey of how one takes over and then another one kind of takes over, and then you might go back and then you might be both. And you're always kind of looking ahead to see what it is that might be coming as the next big one. And it really does evolve that way in this industry. And that's a weird thing because you can have a music business and still be making money and your revenue's changing. It's a very strange thing. If you sell a product in a retail store, that's always where you're going to make your revenues. How much of that product, and you might change what product it is, but you're always selling product. Here it can be so different how you're ending up generating your income, still being an artist at the center.
Having that diversity, though, allows you to be a little bit more choosy at what you take as well. When it comes to even like what you said, you were at that point done doing what you were doing, driving in your car saying, I need to do something different. And having multiple revenue streams like that allows you to follow your passions in different ways if you didn't have that and you were only stuck with one path on your journey.
Yeah. The other funny parallel that came out of his story to Sides was that using Logic attracted Apple. So it was another example where he sort of put himself out there and then got their attention by being so useful and so valuable in that skill set. And I think that's really kind of funny that we've now seen that twice. If there's something that you really want to attract out there, you need to just keep putting out how valuable and becoming so valuable at that thing that they're going to notice you. That this is sort of the reoccurring theme here.
And he still creates music every day, all the time. And so many times you hear, just sometimes with musicians more than not, that, they don't do, so they teach.
Yeah.
That's not the case. You can
No.
love giving back to your community and turning back like he does and puts his hand out and says, come along, let me show you a different way of doing it. So
Totally.
I love that about him.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that he highlights there is that he loves teaching. That the other problem with that statement of like those who can't do teach is that most people that can't do still doesn't make them a good teacher.
Yeah, that's true.
You really aren't. It's a hard thing to do to be a good teacher. And in a little bit of a way, it has to do with sales in my mind. It has to do with presenting things in a way that appeals to people because you have to be entertaining to be a teacher, to be a good teacher.
And in so many different ways because everybody learns differently.
Yes. And that's the other aspect of when you struggle in school, you learn how you learn. That's really what I got out of college mostly was learning how to learn, how I learn. And when you become a good teacher, I think you have the understanding that everyone's learning differently and you have the accessibility to allow them to learn the way they learn. It's a much easier process for everyone if they have the opportunity to learn the way that they learn best. And so he's obviously a very good teacher. And such a huge part of that is because of his passion to help others.
I learned when a university has a 12% freshman dropout rate, don't go to that school. I learned there.
Is that, you're saying that was your experience in college?
Oh, yeah. SIU? Oh, my God. I had the best year, the best fun year of my college experience, knowing that only 12% of freshmen graduate from that school. I got kicked out the first semester. I fought to stay there the second semester. I did it, and then I failed out second semester, which, I mean, I wouldn't have done it any other way because I ended up at DePaul. But, you know, it was a hard learning curve.
Well, and that's the other aspect of this. These big moments, they might not always be positive in the moment, right? These big things that you look back on that might define how you got to where you are can often be bad things too. Or in the moment, they can feel like bad things, but in the long run, you'll see that clearer. So we've talked about that a few times, and I just think it's worth bringing up again because I know everyone's struggling in some ways. You know, everyone's got different things they're dealing with. But those things can feel so heavy and they can feel like the problem. And sometimes if we allow ourselves to look at them and be like, how can this actually lead me towards a good thing? Like, what is this teaching me? You know, like, what is this preparing me for? It's really important that we just keep that on our mind when we're dealing with this stuff.
And talk about it with your musician friends. I had a great time in Chicago on Tuesday talking to a friend that I was just bringing her through some of the things that I was going through with branding and things that I wanted to do moving forward. And she works with musicians all day. And she's like, this is, I hear this all the time. And it felt good. She's like, if you're not talking about this stuff, if you're not going through this, you're not growing. So I definitely encourage people that if they're having those hard times to, you know, feel free to talk about it with other musicians, because I think more often than not, they'll agree with you or at least feel for you.
Right, and that's the community aspect showing its head again. Well, from that whole story, I think the best thing that we can offer you as an action step is to keep it real simple. I would spend 10 minutes looking at your current situation, identify if there might be that scary moment of doing the right thing to push your career forward. Maybe that opportunity to do that big moment of your life that changes the trajectory just by making a certain decision might be sitting in front of you right now. It might be something that's waiting for you to be ready, and this might be the opportunity to let yourself figure out what that might be. We know that your time is valuable. We appreciate you spending this time with us and being a part of this community. It is our hope that you feel that sense of community here at Musicians Tip Jar and help spread the word to make us all stronger. If you'd like to get a hold of us or Vince, what's the best way to do that?
You can get a hold of us at musicianstipjar@gmail.com and musicianstipjar.com, where you can check out all the resources and discounts we have collected just for you. Check out all our episodes now on YouTube channel as well. If you find this information useful, please rate and subscribe to the podcast and slam that like button so we can help keep you up on the financial side of your music business. Definitely go to FaderPro.com and look up Vince's name, and you could find all his resources and all his socials there as well. And I'll put it in our liner notes too.
As always, thank you for joining us. And remember, there is already enough for everyone. You just need to know how to get it. Until next time, on behalf of Dave Tamkin and myself, Chris Webb, stay happy, healthy, and wealthy. So often, the key to continuing towards our music goals is not just following the signal, but keeping the right signal to noise ratio. This is Musicians Tip Jar.
Oh Lord, I could use somebody.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, business, or financial professional for individualized advice. Individual results are not guaranteed, and all discussed strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The hosts are operating on behalf of Musicians Tip Jar LLC exclusively.
Could use a little help, hey.